Hello, this is Mark Tooley, editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, with another episode of Marksism, featuring three of us Marks who are editors of Providence, myself, Marc LiVecche, broadcasting from Oxford, England, and Mark Melton, broadcasting from Yorktown, Virginia. Today, we're going to start off our conversation by examining briefly two interviews I conducted this week for Providence, one with a very upbeat and optimistic Nicole Bibbins, Sedaca, a professor of international relations at Georgetown University, who believes that democracy is a universal good aspired to, on some level, by all peoples and cultures. And she believes that even the current upheavals and protests in America and throughout the West in the long term potentially will foster and promote democracy further if the social response to them is positive, and that these protests, in fact, by demonstrating our capacity as a democracy to permit and even to promote dissent and disagreement, will be inherently subversive to repressive regimes around the world, many of whose dictators are highlighting and mocking America for these protests. That was Nicole Bibbins Sedaca with her upbeat perspective. For a much gloomier perspective, I conversed with British commentator Peter Hitchens, who specifically wanted to complain about Providence's portrayal and critique of his grouchiness and gloominess, and that he tends to assume that Britain and America and Western civilization are on the edge of implosion, and yet he takes solace in his own Christian faith, which he came to later in life, having been an atheist and a self-identified Trotskyist earlier in life. So there we have it, two very different views, one Christian and hopeful, one Christian and downbeat. Perhaps collectively they represent a totality of how Christianity views the world, in that we know the world is sinful and in some sense dying, but in the other sense we know that the world is being redeemed. So Marc LiVecche, as a Christian ethicist and theologian, which side do you come down on, upbeat or downbeat?
I am a gloomy optimist, or a gloomy hopeful person. I don't like the word optimist, but no, I think they can be reconciled a little bit. Both of them are pushing against a gassy kind of happiness that is groundless and untethered to reality. You look around and there's a lot to be grouchy about, as he pointed out. I happen to be, I didn't see him standing up. I should have looked for him. I should have known he was there. But my son and I happened to be at the protest against the Rhodes statue.
In Oxford.
And I assure you, Peter, in Oxford, we had just returned from tennis and we're on the high street, and I knew the protest was happening. So I figured we would go there and see if we could get gassed or something. But it was entirely peaceful. We were standing up. Nobody badgered us to take a knee, or as he said, to take our buttocks. So I'm a gloomy optimist. I think there's evils we can reduce now. There's the promise that we win in the end, that goodness, truth, and do no harm, and we help where we are able. So that's me.
So you're a Niebuhrian in that sense, Mark LiVecche?
That's right. That's right. Except, with all the usual qualifications that I give Niebuhr, but yes.
Mark Melton, you're a Calvinist Presbyterian. I assume that you're gloomy, aren't you?
Well, I would say that I'm, believing total depravity. I have a bit of a perspective on where we're never going to expect people to be good, and we are not going to expect that we're going to be able to sing Kumbaya completely, but things go up and things go down, and they can go up and down at the same time. And we can see where some parts of the world, Christians are facing a lot of difficulty, and other parts of the world, Christianity is expanding. We can see where, race relations can improve from the 1960s, but they can also still be problematic, to this day. And these things can be true at the same time. And so, yeah, a mix. And I think that's, I think a lot of Christians, not just people from the Reformed tradition broadly, might say that.
Well, I am likely guilty of the sin that Peter Hitchens targeted, quoting a 19th century pope, satanic optimism, which apparently was linked to capitalism and democratic sentiments, and probably something a certain brand of Protestants are particularly susceptible to, and maybe Methodists in particular believe that whole societies can be redeemed. But and I would say that Providence was founded as a journal and as a force for hope and some sense of optimism, in the sense that we believe God has a plan for America and the world. Well, moving on to our next topic, Marc LiVecche had a provocative interview with a young man, a theologian who got his PhD at Azusa Pacific, I believe, talking about race relations, the current protest. He took as a black man himself, he took a contrarian perspective in terms of what ails America on the issue of race. If you could outline that conversation for us a little bit, Mark LiVecche.
Yeah, absolutely. Derek Green, belongs to I suppose surely it is a minority, but it's a strong minority of thinkers from the Black community who push against some of the stereotypes that attempt to describe what is going on in America at the moment. What I like about what Derek had to say, among much else, we discussed racism, we discussed the basis for hope, we discussed a Christian anthropology versus a racial anthropology. What I liked about what he had to say is that it helps to illustrate both, I think, the contribution that Providence as a journal is trying to make to American discourse, as well as what the role of a Christian ethicist is. Looking at ethics, the first job of ethics is to get the facts on the ground as accurately described as we can. And for a Christian ethicist especially, that's incumbent because we are called to love and to walk in the truth. So we have to be scrupulously fair. We have to accurately represent reality to the degree that we are able, and to the degree that we are made to be able to see it. And so when it comes to a highly contentious issue like race or police violence, we have to push against sort of the dual temptations, either toward cynicism or hopeless optimism, or hopeful optimism, that tend to define such debates. So when you look at police violence, highly divisive. On the one side, you sometimes, as the extreme, have hyper outrage. And on the other side, you have indifference or a dismissive denial of there being any problem really at all. He provides a third way. He recognizes that those extremes are both poisonous, and to the degree that they are grounded in emotion and not in fact, they're even more poisonous. So he pushes against several untruths. He pushes against the untruth that police violence is at such a level that it's essentially, as Black Lives Matter says on their website, open season on blacks. He pushes against the idea that law enforcement doesn't protect or save the lives of those in the Black community. And he pushes, or he stresses that while there is a culture of corruption within the law enforcement community, it's not a culture of corruption that goes entirely unchecked. So when we ask questions like who polices the police, well, sometimes the police police the police. Sometimes other institutions come in and police the police. So he doesn't see hopelessness there. And he pushes against the sort of unqualified assertion that law enforcement in America is characterized by systematic and systemic racism. He just says it's much more complicated than that. You look at the available data from the FBI, there was a Yale University report done. It's a complicated, much more nuanced story. And Derek Green does a fantastic job of bringing a lot of that important nuance to the story so that it's not hyperbole, but it's data that's driving our arguments.
Well, I think Derek also makes an important point about God being greater than racism. Often there's a perspective even put forward by Christians. It almost sounds like process theology and assumes that evil such as racism have an almost eternal life that's parallel to the works of God that can never be surmounted. So certainly we as Christians who believe in divine sovereignty know that's not the case. Well, Mark Melton,
No, that's correct. And I should just, if I could just say, just to plug for the other blog, his piece or his interview with me should be coupled with an essay he wrote for Juicy, I think this week. So both should be checked out. And he provides resources at within both for people who want to do further reading. So it's good stuff.
there was an email exchange among us three Marks, to which Mark Melton contributed his experiences growing up in the Deep South, which were different from myself and Marc LiVecche, who grew up farther north. So, Mark Melton, you believe that racism in America is much more systemic than perhaps the other two of us have experienced. Share just a few words about that.
Well, I won't go into what word we should use to best describe it, but I would say that growing up, I was much more optimistic about race relations. The town I grew up in did not celebrate the 4th of July because the Confederate forces in that town surrendered on July 4th. And it was shortly before I was born that they actually started shooting off fireworks again. So growing up, I thought race relations had improved a lot. And, they probably had, or they obviously had. But
this is in Mississippi.
Yes, I grew up in Vicksburg, Mississippi. So later on, though, I did a research project on how did race relations affect the church. And actually part of that research was my writing sample when I applied for the deputy editor position here. And in that I did, several interviews. And one of the things I found was just scratching just a little bit beneath the surface, I found a lot of racism that I wasn't expecting to find. I had assumed that a lot of the racism was amongst older people who had been through the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s who held on to racist beliefs. Frankly, I heard of just blatant racism growing up. I think I have written to y'all that I had heard more biblical arguments for segregation than I had for biblical arguments for just war tradition or for pacifism growing up. Not a ton, but considering I never heard anything about just war tradition or Christian realism, I definitely more than that. So I was shocked though when just scratching beneath the surface just a little bit when I heard people close to my own age calling me radical for saying that Christians should be able to worship together despite whatever their skin tones are. And so yeah, from my perspective, it seems much more widespread than I had originally thought when I was younger. And I would also say some of the people I interviewed, they were not just from Mississippi, and they were from different parts of America and different parts of the world. And they kind of came to the same conclusion I did.
Well, very important to reflect on. I hope you can write a piece for us on that, Mark Melton. And then finally, I should say many of us have returned to the IRD Providence office as the pandemic seems to be receding, but Mark Melton wrote a piece on how the pandemic has affected American society. So again, Mark, a few words about that?
Right. So it seems that a lot of people think the pandemic's over. The news cycle has moved on, but of course it's not. Houston this morning or yesterday is considering reinstituting lockdowns, I saw. I haven't looked at a lot of the details of that, but we see spikes across the country. And you could look at this as a second wave or the fact that the pandemic's finally reaching those areas. And so in my article, I'm responding or kind of building upon what Deborah Erickson wrote about, where a lot of people are comparing the pandemic to war. And she kind of wrote about a lot of the problems with that. And so I don't really go into some of those same issues, but to me, from the very beginning, the pandemic felt much more like a hurricane or some other type of natural disaster. In my experience, I've seen more hurricanes, or at least my family has been through some more hurricanes. And so in my piece, I go through different points, dealing with uncertainty where, 10 days out, the scientists say that the hurricane can hit a range of areas and it gets narrow and narrow, and the communities within that cone of uncertainty have to respond. People need to trust the government to give them the most accurate information, and generally with hurricanes we can. In some situations like the Great Storm of 1900 that devastated Galveston, the US government did not give them good information and it killed 10,000 or so people. So there is an issue of trust, there's an issue of uncertainty, but the biggest problem I see with comparing a pandemic to a war is that it makes us think, it gives us overconfidence. We think we have more control over it, especially as Americans where we have overwhelming power. But with a pandemic, it's more like a hurricane. You can't stop a hurricane. You can't surrender to a hurricane. You can make a calculated risk that says, I can go outside. You can look out your window to determine that. You can't really do that with war, where you can say, or you can't surrender to to a pandemic. So those are kind of some of my thoughts there.
Well, we refer our listeners to Mark Melton's very good article. Any final words of wisdom and insight from you, Marc LiVecche?
No, just a plug for the tripartite authored piece on nuclear missiles. I'm writing a book on the bombing of Hiroshima, so nukes are sort of close to my heart. I'm not sure that's exactly correct, but they're on my mind. And the article we published does a lot of very essential brush clearing on that. And again, it pushes against the hyperbole and replaces it with data. So it's an excellent article. Really thrilled that we published that.
This was a piece by Will Inboden,
Peter Fever, and Michael Singh. I don't know how you say his last name.
All of whom are Christians, of course, all of whom served in the George W. Bush administration. So it's a very insightful article responding to a piece that appeared in Christianity Today magazine that was more negative on nuclear deterrence. Well, thank you so much for joining us for another exciting episode of
Will was there at the founding, so.
Yes, and Will Inboden is a contributing editor to Providence. Thank you again, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Thanks.